Picture this. It is the early hours of February 22nd, 2026, and Mexican special forces are closing in on a safe house in Tlajomulco de Zúñiga, just outside Guadalajara. Inside is the most wanted man in Mexico, Nacio Osigua Tevantes, known to the world as El Mencho, the supreme commander of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Within minutes, that operation ends. El Mencho is gone, and within 48 hours, the entire country begins to burn. Coordinated revenge strikes explode across more than 20 Mexican states. Highways choke with blazing vehicles. Businesses are incinerated. Ordinary families are caught in the crossfire of something far beyond a law enforcement operation. What follows is not just retaliation, it is a declaration, a criminal empire, sending a message in smoke and fire that it will not go quietly. This is what Mexico is living through right now, as of February 26, 2026, and here is what this moment makes undeniably clear. The cartel problem in Mexico stopped being about drugs a long time ago. This is about who truly holds power over an entire nation. Buckle up, because here is the full devastating breakdown you need to understand right now. Before we get into the chaos that followed, you need to understand exactly who El Mencho was and what his organization had become, because without that context, none of what happened next makes sense. El Mencho had spent over a decade as the most hunted man in Mexico. The United States government placed a $10 million bounty on his head, the single largest reward ever offered for a Mexican cartel figure. He survived multiple attempts on his life. He outlasted countless military operations designed specifically to bring him down. And in that time, he transformed the CJNG from a regional faction into a transnational criminal empire with a footprint in all 32 Mexican states and active operations in more than 50 countries. According to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the CJNG controls an estimated 35% of all illegal narcotics flowing into the United States, generating annual revenues that exceed $20 billion. El Mencho was not simply a cartel boss. He was the chief architect of one of the most formidable and sophisticated criminal enterprises in modern recorded history. When Mexican intelligence received actionable information about his location on February 22nd, President Claudia Sheinbaum authorized an immediate military strike. Elite special forces units, backed by helicopter gunships and armored vehicles, descended on the safe house at dawn. According to official reports, El Mencho's protection detail opened fire the moment forces arrived, igniting a 90-minute firefight that left the cartel leader and at least 8 of his bodyguards fallen. Authorities recovered high-caliber weapons, encrypted communication devices, and evidence confirming that El Mencho had been actively directing operations from that location. That evening, President Sheinbaum addressed the nation, declaring his neutralization, a defining victory in Mexico's war against organized crime, and assuring citizens that security forces stood ready against any retaliation. Those assurances would prove devastatingly inadequate before the night was over. Now stop for a second and think about this before we go further. Was neutralizing El Mencho actually a victory for Mexico? Or did the government just kick open a door they had no plan for? Drop your take in the comments right now, because what happened in the next 48 hours will seriously challenge how you answer that question. The retaliation began within 2 hours of the official announcement. The first reports came out of Guadalajara. Masked gunmen hijacked public buses, forced every passenger off at gunpoint, and set the vehicles ablaze at major intersections throughout the city. By 8 p.m. local time on February 22nd, at least 15 burning vehicles were creating gridlock across Guadalajara alone. But Guadalajara was only the opening move. Within the following hour, simultaneous strikes erupted in Puerto Vallarta, Zapopan, Tlaquepaque, Tonala, and Chapala. Then the wave pushed far beyond Jalisco. Reports cascaded in from Guanajuato, where gunmen torched vehicles along Highway 45, from Michoacán, where burning trucks sealed off the entrance to Morelia, from Colima, where gas stations were firebombed, from Veracruz, where cartel operatives struck a police substation. The coordination was staggering in its precision. Over 65 separate attack sites spread across 23 Mexican states, all activated within the first 3 hours of El Mencho's confirmed neutralization. This was not spontaneous rage. This was a pre-designed contingency operation engineered to demonstrate that even without its leader, the CJNG possesses the capacity to bring Mexico to its knees. And it worked. As of February 25th, Mexican authorities have confirmed at least 87 vehicles destroyed, 19 gas stations attacked or set ablaze, and more than 150 businesses damaged or looted across the affected regions. But those totals are still climbing as damage assessments push into more remote areas. The geographic scope of the strikes exposes just how deeply the CJNG's infrastructure is embedded across the country. They did not limit themselves to major urban centers. They hit small towns, rural highways, and border crossings with equal precision. In Nayarit, they severed the coastal highway connecting Puerto Vallarta to Tepic, stranding thousands of tourists with no route forward. In Guanajuato, already one of Mexico's most violently contested states, they launched synchronized strikes against state police installations in Celaya, Irapuato, and León. In Veracruz, they targeted the port of Coatzacoalcos, one of Mexico's most strategically critical shipping hubs. Every target was chosen deliberately. This was not vandalism. This was a sophisticated campaign of strategic disruption designed to paralyze transportation networks, strangle commerce, and broadcast an unmistakable message to the Mexican state and the watching world. The CJNG can reach anywhere, and they can do it fast. The human cost of these 4 days of coordinated violence is still being fully assessed, but what has already been confirmed is devastating. Mexican authorities have verified 34 civilian casualties directly tied to the revenge campaign. At least 11 people lost their lives, trapped inside vehicles, caught in the path of burning blockades. 8 more perished from gunfire during active cartel operations across multiple states. Another 15 succumbed in the cascading accidents triggered by the chaos, cars colliding with flaming wreckage, individuals suffering cardiac episodes while attempting to flee. Among those who perished was a mother and her 2 young children, overcome by smoke inhalation after their vehicle became sealed between 2 burning buses on the Guadalajara to Tepic highway. Beyond those who lost their lives, over 120 individuals have been hospitalized with injuries spanning severe burns to gunshot trauma. Emergency rooms across Jalisco, Guanajuato, and Michoacan are at capacity. Medical staff are running double shifts, blood supplies are critically depleted, and the psychological damage, the raw terror now embedded in the daily experience of ordinary families across these states, is something no statistic can capture. Emergency services across the affected states buckled almost immediately under the pressure. Guadalajara's municipal fire department alone reported receiving over 200 emergency calls within the first 6 hours of the attacks. Ambulances found themselves physically blocked by burning vehicles and cartel checkpoints, unable to reach the victims who needed them most. One paramedic operating in Zapopan described the situation to reporters with striking clarity, saying that what they were experiencing felt like a war zone, with armed men blocking roads and threatening crews who tried to reach the injured. Police forces, already hollowed out by years of sustained cartel pressure, were simultaneously pulled in dozens of directions across multiple municipalities. The infrastructure that civilians rely on in moments of crisis simply failed, and people across Jalisco and 22 other states were left to navigate a nightmare without the protection that their government had promised them. The economic devastation that followed these attacks is being compared by economists to the scale of a major natural disaster, and that framing is not an exaggeration. Initial damage assessments placed direct losses from destroyed infrastructure, incinerated vehicles, and looted businesses at over $400 million. But that number does not begin to account for the broader economic paralysis gripping the region. Schools across Jalisco, Guanajuato, and Michoacan remain shuttered as of today, leaving over 2 million students unable to attend classes. Government offices across affected municipalities have suspended operations. Major corporations including Walmart, Coca-Cola, Bimbo, and FEMSA have halted distribution networks and closed facilities across western Mexico. The Guadalajara International Airport has been crippled by mass flight cancellations. United Airlines, Air Canada, Delta, and Aeromexico have all suspended service to Puerto Vallarta and Guadalajara, citing unacceptable security conditions on the ground. Mexico's tourism board estimates that the travel industry alone will absorb losses exceeding $600 million in the first month, as reservations evaporate and cruise lines reroute away from Mexican ports entirely. And when you combine those figures with the broader business disruption, the total economic impact surpasses $1 billion in damage across the affected region. People are also voting with their feet. Entire neighborhoods in Guadalajara have emptied as families load vehicles and leave for safer parts of the country. Bus terminals are overwhelmed with residents trying to get out. Highways heading east toward Mexico City and south toward Osaka are jammed with cars carrying luggage and children. Social media is saturated with posts from Jalisco residents asking whether it is safe to return, whether schools will reopen, whether the worst is truly over. Many are not waiting for answers. Real estate agents in Guadalajara report property inquiries have plummeted 80% in just 3 days, while agents in cities like Querétaro and San Miguel de Allende are reporting surges in relocation interest from families fleeing Jalisco. This is a mass displacement event driven by terror, and it is unfolding in real time. Here is something that deserves your full attention right now, and we will come back to it. If you want to stay ahead of how this situation develops and what it signals for Mexico's future stability, make sure you are subscribed to this channel and have notifications turned on, because this story is not over, not even close, and what comes next could be more significant than what we have already seen. Forensic teams are currently working around the clock to process crime scenes spread across 23 states. Victims are being recovered and transported to overwhelmed facilities. Families are lining up at government offices, trying to locate missing relatives. Tow crews are hauling away the charred remains of vehicles, leaving scorch marks on Mexican highways that will be visible for months. Municipal workers are repairing damaged buildings and working to restore basic services, but many businesses will not return. Insurance companies are already denying claims, categorizing the cartel attacks as acts of war rather than standard covered events. Small business owners who lost everything are staring down bankruptcy. The physical scars of what happened will heal slowly. The economic and psychological ones may be permanent for many of the people who lived through it. Technology served two competing purposes in this crisis, and the implications of both are significant. Mexican intelligence officials have confirmed that the CJNG coordinated strikes across multiple states simultaneously using encrypted messaging platforms, including Signal and Telegram. Witnesses at several blockade sites reported seeing drones overhead, almost certainly deployed for real-time surveillance of police movements and to help operatives manage escape routes. On the opposite side of that equation, social media blew the lid off the scale of the devastation in real time. Tourists in Puerto Vallarta uploaded footage of smoke columns rising from blocked highways. Guadalajara residents live-streamed burning buses, choking major intersections. Within hours, footage from dozens of separate attack sites was spreading across X, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. International news organizations pulled from that footage, and the world watched Mexico burn through hundreds of smartphone screens simultaneously. The government had no mechanism to control that narrative, because the evidence was already everywhere and it had been put there by ordinary citizens. The intelligence picture behind these attacks tells a story that goes well beyond revenge. At multiple attack sites, cartel operatives left behind narco-mantas, cloth banners bearing messages in Spanish that translate roughly as, "This is what happens when you touch our leader." El Mencho is gone, but the CJNG is eternal. We are everywhere. This is only the beginning. Some banners specifically named President Sheinbaum and Jalisco Governor Enrique Alfaro, with direct threats. Others contained warnings aimed at rival organizations, cautioning them not to attempt territorial expansion during the transition period. Mexican federal intelligence has confirmed that operational orders originated from within the cartel's senior command structure, specifically from Ricardo Ruiz Velasco, known as El Doble R, who is now assessed to be positioning himself as El Mencho's successor. Intercepted and analyzed communications revealed that these attacks were not improvised. They had been planned months in advance as a contingency protocol, a doomsday response to be triggered in the event El Mencho was ever captured or taken out. But the attacks were not purely about vengeance. They were also about something more strategically calculated. With El Mencho's neutralization, a massive leadership vacuum has opened at the top of one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations. Multiple internal factions are now maneuvering for supremacy. Intelligence assessments suggest that Doble R deliberately orchestrated the scale and reach of these revenge operations, partly to establish his own dominance within that competition. By demonstrating the ability to coordinate a multi-state offensive of this magnitude on short notice, he is sending a direct signal to rival CJNG commanders. The message is simple: I have the infrastructure, I have the loyalty networks, I am the one running this now. But that also means Mexico may be entering a phase of internal CJNG conflict, a succession war between factions that could make the current violence look like an opening chapter rather than the main event. Here is your second comment question, and this one genuinely matters for where Mexico goes from here. Do you think the CJNG holds together under El Doble R, or does it fracture into competing factions fighting each other for control? Because that answer will essentially define Mexico's security landscape for the next decade. Tell us what you think below. To understand why this moment is historically unprecedented, you have to look at what the CJNG has done before. This is not the first time the organization has launched mass retaliation. In 2015, following the arrest of a regional cartel commander, the CJNG shot down a Mexican military helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade, taking the lives of 9 personnel. In 2020, after authorities detained El Mencho's wife, the cartel organized a wave of vehicle blockades across Guadalajara that lasted several hours before military pressure forced a halt. Both of those incidents sent shockwaves through Mexican society, but nothing the CJNG has done previously approaches the scale, coordination, speed, or geographic reach of what has unfolded since February 22nd, 2026. The difference is not just size, it is the sophistication. The simultaneous activation of sleeper cells across 23 states within hours of a leadership event demonstrates that the CJNG has evolved from a powerful regional criminal organization into something that operates with the coordination capacity of a military-grade network, one capable of shutting down multiple Mexican states at the same moment. And here is the dimension of this that should concern every observer beyond Mexico's borders. The CJNG just published a blueprint. If a Mexican government operation against a cartel leader can trigger a simultaneous multi-state shutdown of this scale, what happens the next time authorities move against the Sinaloa Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, or the Northeast Cartel? Every major criminal organization in Mexico watched what happened over the past 4 days. They took notes, and the lesson they absorbed is that the Mexican state cannot shield its civilian population when a cartel chooses to respond with overwhelming, coordinated force. That is not just a Mexican problem. That is a regional security problem with consequences that reach well beyond any border. The Mexican government's response has been massive on paper, but insufficient in practice. Within 12 hours of the initial attacks, President Sheinbaum deployed an additional 5,000 federal troops and 2,500 National Guard personnel to Jalisco and surrounding states. As of February 25th, over 8,000 military personnel are active in affected areas. Armored convoys patrol Guadalajara's major arteries. Checkpoints have been established on every significant highway across Jalisco. Helicopter gunships conduct continuous surveillance over known CJNG strongholds. The visible militarization is at a scale residents describe as feeling like martial law. But even with that overwhelming presence, the attacks have not fully stopped. On February 24th, the CJNG carried out smaller strikes in residential Guadalajara neighborhoods, targeting parked vehicles, firing on military patrols, and posting narco banners with direct threats to named government officials. The cartel is communicating something very deliberately. They can sustain this campaign. The government's military presence is a constraint, not a solution. As of February 25th, Mexican authorities report 47 arrests connected to the attacks. The overwhelming majority of those detained are low-level operatives, individuals captured at blockade sites or identified through social media footage posted during the strikes. Doble R, and the rest of the CJNG's senior leadership remain free and operational, almost certainly already mapping out their next strategic moves. President Sheinbaum held a press conference on February 24th, calling the attacks cowardly terrorism and pledging that all responsible parties would face justice. Governor Alfaro declared a formal state of emergency in Jalisco and imposed a temporary curfew across Guadalajara and its surrounding municipalities. These responses project strength, but the cartel figures who actually ordered these attacks remain untouched, and everyone watching understands that. Internationally, the pressure on Mexico is intensifying rapidly. The United States has issued a travel advisory warning American citizens to avoid Jalisco, Guanajuato, and Michoacán. The DEA released a formal statement designating the CJNG as the single most dangerous criminal organization currently threatening U.S. national security and reaffirmed its commitment to cooperate with Mexican authorities. But frustration in Washington is mounting. A vocal faction of U.S. lawmakers is renewing calls for unilateral American military operations inside Mexican territory, specifically targeting cartel leadership infrastructure. President Sheinbaum has categorically rejected that framing as an unacceptable violation of Mexican sovereignty. The tension between the two governments over cartel strategy is not new, but these attacks have sharpened it considerably, and that friction will intensify as more footage and casualty figures continue to reach American audiences. So what does all of this mean for Mexico's trajectory going forward? The answer that experts keep arriving at, even when they disagree on almost everything else, is that the so-called kingpin strategy, the doctrine of targeting and neutralizing individual cartel leaders, is fundamentally broken and may be making things actively worse. Yes, Mexican authorities neutralized El Mencho. Yes, they removed the most wanted figure in the country's organized crime landscape. But the price tag on that outcome is 34 civilian casualties, over 120 people hospitalized, more than $1 billion in combined economic losses, and a nation paralyzed by fear, while a criminal organization demonstrates that it can operate without its founder. The CJNG is still moving fentanyl across the US border. It is still extorting businesses throughout western Mexico. It is still pulling young men from impoverished communities into its ranks because no other economic path is available to them. Eliminating El Mencho did not weaken the cartel in any operationally meaningful way. It made them more desperate, more aggressive, and more determined to project invulnerability during the most vulnerable transition in their organization's history. Expert opinion on what comes next breaks in three distinct directions. The first camp argues that Mexico must abandon the kingpin strategy entirely and redirect resources toward building genuine institutional capacity, strengthening and reforming local police forces, overhauling a judicial system that cartels have learned to navigate and exploit, and creating real economic alternatives in communities where criminal recruitment currently goes completely unopposed. The second camp argues that the only path forward is escalation, designating cartels formally as terrorist organizations and conducting a sustained, all-out campaign of force until their infrastructure is dismantled. The third camp contends that the realistic path runs through negotiation and harm reduction, accepting that cartels cannot be fully eliminated in the near term and focusing instead on suppressing violence and protecting civilian populations from the worst of it. There is no consensus among those who study this most closely, and while that debate continues, ordinary Mexicans keep paying the price. For the people living in Jalisco and across the other 22 affected states, life is now defined by the slow and uncertain process of trying to return to something resembling normalcy. Schools are tentatively planning to resume next week. Many parents are not ready to send their children. Businesses are surveying the damage and wrestling with whether to rebuild in place or relocate to safer ground. The military presence continues, but residents understand with a clarity that no official reassurance can dissolve that soldiers will eventually redeploy, and the cartel will still be there when they do. Every person in these communities now carries a visceral, unshakable understanding that this can happen again. That is the deepest and most lasting wound these attacks inflict, not the burned vehicles or the shuttered businesses, or even the heartbreaking casualty toll. It is the permanent installation of fear into the daily fabric of ordinary life. And we need to say something clearly about who bears the full weight of that reality. The wealthy have options. They can afford private security details. They can relocate to safer cities or exit the country entirely when the situation deteriorates. But working-class families do not have those choices. They are anchored in neighborhoods where the cartel is the governing authority in every practical sense. They pay extortion fees to operate small businesses that feed their families. They watch their children get drawn into criminal networks because there is no other ladder available. They cannot afford to flee when violence erupts. They are the ones waiting in overwhelmed emergency rooms with injured family members. They are the ones forming lines outside government offices, trying to locate missing relatives. The true measure of Mexico's cartel war is not found in casualty tallies or property damage estimates. It is found in the millions of people who live in sustained fear, who have lost all faith that the institutions meant to protect them are capable of doing so, who have watched their communities fracture while officials cycle through promises that never translate into safety. As of right now, the situation across Mexico remains volatile. The CJNG has reduced the pace of attacks over the past 24 hours, but Mexican intelligence analysts are warning that this almost certainly represents a tactical pause rather than a genuine de-escalation. The cartel is believed to be regrouping, studying the government's response, and determining its next operational phase. Reports indicate that Doble R has convened a meeting of regional CJNG commanders to consolidate his authority and set the organization's direction through the transition. Meanwhile, rival organizations are watching every development with intense interest. The Sinaloa cartel, currently fractured by a brutal internal conflict between factions aligned with El Chapo's sons and those loyal to Ismael Zambada, may interpret this moment as a strategic opening to expand into territory the CJNG is temporarily unable to fully defend. If that calculation leads to action, Mexico could find itself managing a multi-front cartel war across several states simultaneously, a scenario that would make what has unfolded over the past 4 days look like a rehearsal. So here is the final question, and it is the one that cuts deepest. Does the Mexican government have any meaningful, functional control over cartel-dominated states like Jalisco? Or are we watching in real time as state authority in large parts of Mexico quietly collapses? Because the evidence accumulated over just the past 4 days paints a picture that is very difficult to interpret as anything other than a government that cannot protect its own people when a criminal organization decides to demonstrate what it is truly capable of. And we owe it to the ordinary Mexicans living inside that reality to say that clearly and not look away from what it means. What is unfolding in Mexico right now is not simply a law enforcement story or a drug war update. It is a story about whether a nation can maintain its sovereignty, protect the fundamental safety of its citizens, and preserve the legitimacy of its institutions against criminal organizations that have evolved to operate like armies. The neutralization of El Mencho will not end the CJNG. The evidence of the past 4 days suggests it may have made them more dangerous by creating internal competition for dominance and generating a desperate organizational need to project absolute strength during the most vulnerable leadership transition in the cartel's history. If the government's answer to this moment is more military operations aimed at more cartel leaders, history suggests we should expect this cycle to repeat itself in other states with other organizations at the cost of more ordinary lives.